another thought that came to mind while I was praying, and of course couldn't stop and write it down. I wanted to share with you all, and of course I'm glad this is actually on the recording, so everybody watching this will know. Janet came to Bible study last Tuesday night. I told her, I said, I'm so glad you came. These women think you are a figment of my imagination. Because we've got so many, particularly there at Buffett Heights, who never met her. And so that was just so exciting. So she said she's going to try to come at least to one of the others through this fall study. So I told her that would be great because we got a lot here. And here, Amy never met her. You've met her, haven't you? And all the rest of us have. So that'll be good. All right, are you ready? The first thing that I said in your lesson for this week was, remember, this is John's version of the story. And it's really hard to think about this event. It's really hard to teach this just focusing on John's version because our minds know the story. As I said in my prayer, we study this, and where we are is pre-cross. We're just on the verge of going to the cross, but we know what takes place on the other side of the cross. And so if we had to stay here, what a dark place that would be, what a painful place that would be to stay. But it's really hard to teach it without bringing all that in. Even if you try to make yourself focus on just this, we have to bring other parts of it in to explain the things that are said. Because some things that seem to be said out of the blue. Well, why did he say that? Why did he do that? Because of something else that was said and done. And we have to know that. But so much of this whole event, the way it flows, because of so much as what is said, is dependent on something that we're told in the other Gospels. So we will bring that in, but I hope as you read this, at least reading it through the first time, you made yourself just focus on what John said. So let's talk about that overview. If you did that, before reading the other Gospels, what were some things that came to your mind as you were reading John that your mind automatically filled in?
Jesus was sent to Herod.
Yeah, Jesus was sent to Herod. And only Luke gives us that of the other three, right? Yeah, that is I remember arguing with a pastor once. I said there were 6 trials, and he said, no, there were just 5. And he names them all. And I said, no, there were 6. Because he goes to Pilate, then he goes to Herod, and then he goes back to Pilate. Well, if you want to count Pilate twice, okay. But yeah, so that actually is a separate trial because a whole series of different things happen there. What else came to your mind as you were reading it? Pilate's wife's dream, yes. And that will especially play into the next lesson. By the way, next week is fall. Next week is fall break. We won't be having Bible study next week, so we'll have it the week after. But in our next lesson, that will really play into that because it explains something that John says that otherwise we wouldn't have known why. What else? You think of anything else? Or what questions came to your mind as you were reading this? Did it open up? Did you learn something new? Did something surprise you? Did it open up any questions for you? Boy, you are a talkative bunch. Did any of other John's gospel come to mind as you were reading this? Now, Jesus has said over and over who he is and what he's done and what he came for. And you see, even if it's not overt of what he has said and done, you see undertones of that in his interaction with Pilate. Well, as I in your overview section there, I said that this portion comprises Jesus' fourth trial. This is the first trial in front of a Gentile. The other three have been Jewish trials, and now we come to the first Gentile trial. As we've said about all the others having illegal components to them, this one is also illegal or has illegal components to it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Well, this lesson and the next gives us Jesus' interaction with Pilate. And I really wish we didn't have to skip next week, because these two lessons really need to be done together. They need to go back to back. It would be good to do them together, but there's far too much to try to cover to do them both together if we want to cover the details like we do. This flow, as it takes place, there is a lot that happens within this that John doesn't record. In just reading this, I noticed as I was actually looking at the section, I thought, okay, this is only 12 verses of Scripture. But there is so much that takes place that fits in and around this. This is now, John does give us things that the others don't. But there's so much that fits in around this that causes it to flow together. If we're reading through John's gospel, if you're just, you're reading a chapter a day or whatever, or you're reading book by book for your Bible study time or your daily reading or whatever, and you're reading through the book of John, and you come to verse 24, and it says, Annas therefore sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And then verse 28 says, and they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium. And you're like, wait, what? Would he just go by and wave at Caiaphas on his way to the praetorium? What happened there? I mean, he took him to Caiaphas and then they left Caiaphas. Something had to have happened there with Caiaphas. And when we think about the story, then we who know the story, realize that John has left out the whole trial with Caiaphas, the whole major thrust, the major portion of when our pastors teach or preach on this during Holy Week or it may be in a series leading up to Easter. That particular trial with Caiaphas is the one that's always covered. The one where they bring in the false witnesses and they keep trying to accuse Jesus and then Caiaphas it says, I adjure you by God, are you the Son of God, or are you the Messiah? And Jesus says, it is as you have said, and then he tears his cloak. That's the part of the story that we know actually better than any other part of it. But John expects, as he's writing this, remember, 60 years later, John expects that his readers already know that. They already know what took place. John also leaves out the official trial. Remember, the one in front of Annas was illegal because it was at night, and Annas didn't have anything to do with it anyway. The one with Caiaphas that we just talked about was also illegal because it was at night, and because Caiaphas was, as the high priest, was not supposed to be leading the interrogation. He was supposed to be the judge. He was supposed to be impartial. We saw he was anything but that. There weren't supposed to be false witnesses. And another thing, they weren't supposed to meet anywhere but in the council chamber, which is actually located in the temple complex. So all of those things made that trial illegal. John leaves out the one that is the official trial, the one that is held in the council chamber, in the temple. And only Luke gives us that trial. Now, Matthew and Mark allude to it. They say they gathered together, but they don't tell us anything about it. But Luke tells us actually what happened. But there's so much that happens that we have to piece it together to get that. Luke in giving us that, and we'll talk more about it in a minute, but Luke in giving us that, quote, official trial, it doesn't last more than 15 minutes. It's just kind of like, okay, a rubber stamp on what happened the night before. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But there's something else I noticed. I don't know if you noticed this. I mean, I spent a huge amount of my time. I did it yesterday, but then I actually found myself getting caught up in doing it again this morning, reading all 4 accounts, seeing what each one said, who left in what and who left out what. Exactly who did they say was there? Exactly where did they go? And so I spent so much time doing that as I was reading this one, it hit me. Now, I don't know if you noticed this or not. Something that we don't have in here, something I noticed was the lack of details. Did you notice that, Amy? We've got the facts. We've got the story. But we don't have the details that John shared with us about the arrest. We don't have that it was the right ear of the slave that was cut off. And his name was Malchus. And they built a charcoal fire. Because they were cold. And then it was Malchus's relative that accused Peter of being those details. You remember we talked a lot about that last time. Why do we have those details? John was there. We don't have those kinds of details here. Yes, we have the story. We have the story here. But we don't have those kinds of details. Why do you think that is? John wasn't here. So how do we get the story? How do we know what happened?
People.
John probably talked to other people, but what I'm saying is, where did John get the story? Think about who would have John talked to? Where would he have gotten the story? Because think about where we are. We're inside the praetorium, and we're outside in the courtyard, and we're inside, and we're outside, and it appears from John's gospel that now in the other Gospels, and I'll have to go back and look at my notes again, but I don't remember if the other Gospels talk about going in and out. John's like, they're in and out, and in and out, and in and out. The others read like everything takes place outside, but we know from John that they're in and out. So how would he get the story of what happens inside? Exactly. My first thought was maybe Jesus related all of this to all the disciples during those 40 days after the ascension. And that's possible. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought one partner, maybe more than one, but one people group or one person who would always be there would be a Roman soldier. I mean, even when Pilate is talking to Jesus, reads like they're alone, you know they're not fully alone. There's going to be a soldier there somewhere. And we know that story as Jesus is hanging on the cross, that the centurion says, truly this was the Son of God. Was that the soldier that had been there with Pilate and Jesus? We don't know. We really don't know how this information came about. But again, when we think about this, logically speaking, and this is all happening, we know that there are going to be other people around there who would give us the facts of the story, but not those minute details. that John was fond of giving. So like I said, there had to be at least one, maybe more soldiers present all the time. Maybe that's not important, but for me, it helps me to piece the story together, to piece the timeline together. You may remember in our fall introduction, I said that we studied the forest and the trees and the bark on the trees. Maybe that's just the bark on the trees, but that kind of thing fascinates me. Because it's real, how did they know what they know? So let's dig into the questions. Verse 28. Where does John take us in the next scene? And they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early. So, who are the they? Who led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium? We go back, if you look back in verse 24, as we said a moment ago, it just says Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Well, Jesus didn't go by himself. Somebody had to take him to Caiaphas. And in that case, we said that it had to have been the temple guards, because those were all Jewish trials. Again, John leaves out the trial with Caiaphas, and he leaves out the official trial in the council chamber, but all three of those are Jewish trials. There would not be any Roman soldiers there. From place to place to place in those first three trials, he was taken by temple guard. The temple guard. Now, by the way, the temple guard are not just hired guard. They are all Levites. Remember, the tribe of Levi, they were the people who do all the temple work. The tribe of Aaron would be the priest, but all the rest of the Levites had jobs having to do with the temple. And some of them were temple guard. You could probably dig back in Chronicles or somewhere like that, where it would tell us what actual tribe within Levi was the temple guard. But anyway, I just wanted you to know that they are all Levites. So it would be the temple guard. So then, though, when Jesus is taken to Pilate, who would take him there?
Romans.
Not yet. Still be the temple guards, because they're just taking them to. They wouldn't go and get Roman soldiers to come back and get Jesus and take him back. It would still be the temple guards. Temple guards would be physically doing it, but who's having it done? The Jewish leadership, as John calls them, the Jews, but they are the chief priests. And if you compare, the other three Gospels, all of them, scribes, priests, Pharisees, Sadducees, they're all together for that official trial. But we don't know exactly how many of them and who. It reads like they all went, but I just can't see all 70 of the Sanhedrin and the temple guards making this trek to Pilate. We know that there were priests, and it says elders, and so my opinion on that is that it was mostly high priests, not high priests, but the chief priests, the leadership of that. Luke tells us that when they met in the council, it was the council of elders of the people, both priests, that would be Sadducees, and scribes, that would be Pharisees. And in all three accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, after the trial was over, it says they brought him to Pilate, or they delivered him to Pilate. So, who exactly went with the temple guard to bring Jesus to Pilate? Obviously, as I said, it wasn't the whole council. But in reading the accusations against Jesus while they're there, particularly in Matthew's account, it appears mostly that it was the chief priests and the elders who accused Jesus, and this may be surprising to you, they stirred up the multitudes. The multitudes were there for an entirely different reason. We'll talk about that in a minute, but they stirred up the multitudes. So, where did they take Jesus? The Synoptic Gospels tell us that they took him to Pilate All three say they took him to Pilate. They took him to Pilate. Only John tells us that they took him to the praetorium, or your translation may say the governor's official residence. The King James Version says the judgment hall. So where is that? First of all, the praetorium, the word praetorium simply refers to where the governor resides. Pilate's official residence as the governor of the Judean province was in Caesarea on the coast of the Mediterranean. That was the Roman capital of the province. But during the festivals, he would come to Jerusalem for an increased Roman visibility. But here's the thing. Wherever the governor was, that was the governor's residence. Wherever the governor was, that was the governor's praetorium. Didn't make any difference in a building or in the middle of the field. Wherever the governor was, that was the praetorium. It's like the old saying, wherever you go, there you are. Wherever he went, there he was. Wherever he went was considered the praetorium. Wherever I guess we might say, wherever he laid his head down, that was the praetorium. But where was it in this time, in this particular day? Where was it? Just where in Jerusalem did Pilate reside? So this is where you need your map. On your map, you'll see over toward the left-hand side there, there's a little block there that says Friday, daybreak, number 6, Jesus before Pilate. Everybody see that? You see the building that it's pointing to? That little gray building within that yellow section there. And it says, points to it and says Praetorium, and it also calls it Pilate's palace. This would have been, this palace would have been the palace that Pilate, I keep calling him, Herod the Great built this palace. This palace had been there since well before Jesus' birth. This is where Herod the Great lived. And by the way, you probably already know this, but Herod is referred to as the Great, not because he was a great man, but because he was a great architect. He built Masada. You probably heard about Masada. He built that palace down at Caesarea. I mean, he was a masterful architect. Some of the things that he designed and built are just phenomenal. But he built that palace. And normally, Pilate would have stayed there. However, during this feast, there was a problem. Herod Antipas was in town. And that's where he was staying. Now, one commentary said that it was a huge complex with 2 separate wings, like we talked about last time with Annas and Caiaphas, and that Herod would have been in one part of it and Pilate in the other. But I don't quite see that happening. Many of the older commentaries and the more traditional and conservative commentaries say that Pilate's residence was at the Antonia Fortress. Now, the Antonia Fortress is at the northwest corner of the temple complex. It's a little hard to see on this map. You see where it says Monday cleansing of the temple. You see that little block? And just up to the right, just above it a little bit, it says Antonia Fortress. You see those 2 little things that look like sunglasses? Those 2 little rectangles and then kind of side by side. You see what I'm talking about? That's the Antonia Fortress. That's how the building was designed with those 2 towers. And it was a lot higher. It was on a higher elevation than the temple complex. So the Roman soldiers, they would be garrisoned there 24/7. But when Pilate came into town, that's also where he would stay. He would stay in the Antonia Fortress. It's, as I said, it's a higher elevation than the temple complex, which allowed the Roman soldiers garrisoned there to keep an eye on what was going on in the temple. They were at a higher elevation. They could see down in the temple complex, and they could see everything that was happening. You remember that was one of the reasons that the Jews were so worried about Jesus cleansing the temple, was because they didn't want a riot to ensue and bring in the Roman soldiers. They were afraid if they came down and interfered, that would cause a greater mess. We actually see where that happens. You can just make a note of this and read it later. In Acts 21, at the end of Paul's missionary journeys, when he comes back to Jerusalem at the end of that third missionary journey, and he goes into the temple, and there are some Judaizers that see him in the temple complex in the outside area with a Gentile, and they assume that he has taken this Gentile into the temple in the area where Gentiles were not allowed. And there's this, they actually try to stone Paul, and the Roman soldiers have to come down and break it up. How would they have known? They wouldn't have known, except they would see this take place down there. So that's the Antonia Fortress. That's where all of this is taking place. And actually, it makes much more sense for it to have been there rather than at Herod's palace, because as we'll see in our next lesson, when Pilate sends Jesus out to be scourged by the soldiers, and then he comes back in again, or they bring Jesus back in again, if he were staying there at Herod's palace and he had to send him all the way up to the Antonia Fortress to be scourged, and then brought all the way back again to bring him out in front of the scribes or in front of the priests, and then back up again to the Antonia Fortress to pass sentence on his crucifixion, logistically, that just doesn't make sense. It just makes more sense for everything, all of this to have taken place there in the Antonia Fortress. And another thing that crossed my mind is we're going to be talking a lot about Pilate's demeanor, or what's his attitude in both these next two lessons. And so I thought, Pilate may have been just a little bit peeved that he was having to stay up there with the rest of the soldiers when he might normally stay in the palace. But oh no, Herod's in town. I can't stay down there now.
And there's a Herod's palace in the middle of the...
Oh, Herod Antipas palace. Yeah, this particular map gives us a separate place for Herod Antipas palace. I'm glad you pointed that out. I didn't notice that, because of the commentaries that I read said this Herod's palace was where Herod Antipas would stay. But different maps are going to gear more to different gospels. I haven't seen a map yet that takes all four gospels into account. But I'm glad you made a note of that. Let me circle that, because I'll be sure and mention that in the morning, the next two. So, anyway, I think Antonia Fortress is where all this is taking place, and I think that's where the temple guard took Jesus. So, what's the time frame? What was the time? Early. It was early. Some translations say daybreak, and that's what the word early literally refers to, as just the breaking of day. But what was the hurry? I mean, look at how quickly all of this transpired. Jesus was arrested around 2 or 3 a.m. in the Garden of Gethsemane. Then he was taken to Annas, and then taken over to Caiaphas. Luke 22:66 tells us, and when it was day, that would be at 6 a.m., when it was day, the council of elders of the people assembled. That's the official trial. Both the chief priests and scribes, and they led Jesus away to the council chamber. Remember, that's actually in the temple. We don't have, that red dotted line takes us, you see where it's pointing to the corner there of the temple complex? That's where the council would have met. So they took him there early at 6 a.m. So he's arrested at 2 or 3. All this takes place between Annas and Caiaphas, and then they're there. They can't meet before 6 a.m. legally, before day. And so whatever they're doing, they have him there, you might say, as the doors open, right on time. So they're there in the temple complex. What happens there, if you read Luke's version of that so-called official trial, what happens there doesn't take 15 minutes. What did he say? He did this, he did that. Was it's guilty, let's go. I mean, it's no time. And then off to Pilate they go. The word early, as we said, indicates that it was dawn. Maybe even before 6:30. If that only took a few minutes there in the council chamber, they could easily be up at the Antonia Fortress. You just got to walk out the door and up to the edge of the temple complex. They could easily be there in another 10 or 15 minutes. But again, what's the hurry? You notice how everything is hurried along? The rush of this? What's the hurry? What do you think?
Passover starts at 6.
That evening. Yeah. So this is 6 in the morning. Do they think it's going to take all day?
Crucify him?
To get their part done.
Oh, you mean just the...
Yeah. What's their hurry to get to Pilate at 6 a.m. or 6:30 at the latest? That's why they can't go in. But
they just want to wash their hands of it.
They do. They want it done. They even if they won't have time to re-cleanse themselves too. If they become unclean there, they won't have time. So that wouldn't have had anything to do with the hurry in getting there. That's why they won't go in. Yeah, that's part of it. They want it over with. They want it done.
In their minds, he's guilty.
He's guilty. Let's get on with it. Any other thoughts on that? The conventional thought, just like you said, is that the Jews wanted this over and done with primarily before the word got out. They didn't want Jesus' followers knowing about this. One of the commentaries that I use is real narrative in the way that it's written. And it talks about them being in a hurry to get there and going in the pre-dawn hours and not wanting to be seen by anybody because they didn't want the word to get out what they were doing. It just paints a really neat picture of what's taking place. And if Jesus' followers found out, they would cause a riot or a revolt. That has been the conventional thinking on this all along. But here's something else to think about. I hadn't thought about this before. Think about this. If they waited until later, even later in the morning, well, let me back up. Another thought, but I'll share that, but I need to lead up to it. Another thought is that the Romans like to get business over with early in the day. They had all their meetings or trials, all that very early in the morning. So that was another reason to get him there early. But this just really struck me. If they waited until later in the day, Jesus might not be crucified this day. They might miss their window of opportunity if they didn't get there really early. We know that not only Jesus, but the other 2 men were crucified at 9 a.m. or by 9 a.m. We'll talk about that later. But we've got to remember, again, this is a real event. There were going to be 3 crucifixions that day, whether Jesus was crucified or not. That was already going to happen this day. Whether Jesus was crucified or not, that morning, 3 men got up knowing, or at least thinking, that they were going to die that day by crucifixion. But if the Jews didn't get this done early enough, Jesus' death might just have to wait until after the feasts, after the festival, the whole unleavened bread, a week. Well, they certainly didn't want that to happen, because by that time, that would sure enough give his followers time to gather, to assemble and protest. So it had to be done early. They had to be sure it was done this day. Now, we've talked about before now, and pastors, you've heard your pastors say, he had to die this day, of course, to fulfill prophecy, but he had to be off the cross before 6 p.m., before the Sabbath, before Passover and before the Sabbath began. So that had to be early in order for that to happen. Well, what did the Jewish leaders not do? We've talked a little bit about that already. What did they not do?
They didn't actually take in charge.
No, I mean physically.
Go inside.
They didn't go inside. They led Jesus led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves, remember those two pronouns? When you see two pronouns together, it's that person making the decision. They are doing that in and of themselves. They themselves did not enter into the praetorium. Why? In order that they might not be defiled, lest they, but they might, so they could eat the Passover meal. They didn't enter the governor's residence. Before we talk about Pilate, let's talk a little bit about the Passover. If you were with us, and why we said that Jesus and his disciples actually participated in a Passover meal, what we call the Last Supper. That was a real Passover meal. If that was a real Passover meal, how come the priests had not had theirs yet? Do you remember when we talked about that? You remember what the reason was?
That Jesus knew he was going to die before Passover happened.
But Jesus is participating in a Passover. So how are there two of them?
Well, that was a normal process. I mean, that was their Passover. That was part of their feast.
But it wasn't always a 2-day event. It was generally, Jesus and his disciples actually participated in Passover. He instituted the new covenant. Jesus was also, he died at 3 p.m. at the very hour that the Passover lambs were being slaughtered.
Yeah.
And there were people who will say, well, there's contradiction in the Bible. It can't be both. It's one or the other. Or a lot of commentaries actually say, well, Jesus they weren't really eating the Passover meal. Yeah, they were. And there is an explanation for that. I've actually I printed off what we covered in another lesson, so if you have any questions, we can talk about it later. But I'll just give you the nutshell version of it right now. It had to do, we covered it in great depth when we studied Matthew, but it had to do with how the Jews reckon time. There is a difference between Judean Jews and Galilean Jews, how they reckon time. The Galilean Jews, because they had spent so much time working with Gentiles, their interactions were with Gentiles. There were a lot of Roman soldiers in Capernaum and in different places in the Galilean area that when, what's the old saying? When in Rome, do as Rome. A lot of their reckoning of time had to do with how Rome reckoned time. In fact, that will come up in the next lesson, and you'll see that when you get to it. But they reckon time differently. By Jesus, that's one reason. Another was, by Jesus' day, the sheer numbers of people in Jerusalem for the Passover. There was no way, I think I've shared this before, I'm pulling this number off the top of my head. a few years after this event, there was a census done during a Passover. And if I remember correctly, Josephus said that there was something like over 1 million lambs that were slaughtered. That may not. Maybe it was 100,000. Anyway, it was a huge number of lambs. But when you take into account that it's one lamb per household of 10 people, then that increases the number of people there tenfold. It was a sure, there's no way, I don't care if they pulled out every priest they had, that they could slaughter that many lambs between 3 and 5 p.m. And so, because the Galilean Jews reckon time a little bit differently, the Jewish day actually, goes from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m., where ours goes from midnight to midnight, that the Galilean Jews actually celebrated Passover on the night, what we would call the Thursday night. They would eat it after 6 p.m., which they counted that as the Passover day. It's the next day to them. So and the priests were fully glad to do that. They were willing, as you might say, to fudge on the time just a little bit, as long as we get to do ours on the real day. You can do yours whenever you want to. We do ours on the real day. But what's interesting to me is that many commentaries just skip over that question. But if you talk to people, even just people who are just somewhat barely acquainted with Scripture, they'll pull out things like that and they'll ask you about it. Or your kids or your grandkids will watch the History Channel or Mysteries of the Bible, and they'll say, Nana, he wasn't really having... Yes, he was, and you need to know that so you can explain why. And like I said, I've got a lot more information on that if you have any other questions. But that's the fact. The fact of why the religious leaders hadn't celebrated their Passover yet, and Jesus and his disciples had. But let's talk about the irony of all of this. You ever read anything and you go, that's just something not quite right about that. Can't quite put your finger on it, but there's something that's just not quite right about that. Did anything about this strike you as just not quite right in what they were doing? They didn't want to go in because if they did, they would break the law. What had they just been doing for the past 8-10 hours? Breaking the law, one right after the other. I mean, on the one hand, you have their devotion to the law. And on the other hand, if you did that, you can't go into a Gentile residence, you'd be unclean, you can't participate in the Passover. And then on the other hand, all these laws that they had broken all the way up to this.
Sounds like a massive.
Do what?
Sounds like today.
Exactly.
Laws for thee, but not me.
Yeah. Yeah, we could go down that road. Rules for you, but not for me. Yeah, exactly. Some things never change. It's what's amazing to me, though, is how Scripture fits together. And I've found over these past 10 years or so that we've been doing these Bible studies, because we've been doing them the way we've been doing them, verse by verse, I'll find myself reading something and remembering something that I read somewhere else. Now, I may not know exactly where it's at, but I've got really good search functions on my laptop and on my phone, and I can find it. But I hope you've noticed that. When you read something, you'll remember something else. But here's another thing. Have you ever noticed how you'll be reading something, maybe your daily devotion or maybe your Sunday school lesson, or your pastor will say something and it'll fit right in with something else you've just been reading? Isn't that amazing? Our Sunday school lesson this week, yesterday, was from 1 John. And John wrote that too, so it would make sense that it fits. But 1 John 1:9 says, if we say that we have fellowship with Him, speaking about with God, if we say we have fellowship with Him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. Isn't that exactly what the Jewish leaders were doing? They claimed to have fellowship with God. We're going to keep all the laws. We're going to keep all the rituals. We're going to do this and this and this. But yet they still walked in the darkness. They claimed to be upholding the law of God, and yet they were walking in darkness. They wanted so desperately to eat that Passover lamb. And here right in front of them was whom John had said, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. The real one was right there. But yet they wanted to hurry and eat the fake one. The one that was just a picture of what God was going to do. And they just missed it. So how did Pilate know well, not how, but did Pilate know they were coming? I think so. We're not told that. But I really think that he knew they were coming. This question actually fits in with the next section a little bit better, but I think he did. He knew that on that previous night, Caiaphas or someone had come to him requesting Roman soldiers for the arrest of this man. So he had to have known about the arrest. Now, maybe even the commander had to come back and report to him when they got back. Well, did you make it? Yeah, we arrested him. We turned him over to the Jews. We took him in there. I don't know what the big deal was. This guy didn't even pitch a fit. You know, it was nothing to it, piece of cake. We don't know that for a fact, but that's logical that would happen. How could Pilate not have known? But let's look at what he did. Look at verse 29. Pilate therefore went out to them. Now what's Pilate care what the Jews want, whether they'll come into the praetorium or not? Some may argue, yeah, he knew about the arrest, but he thought the arrest, but he thought they'd take care of it themselves. He never expected them to bring him to him. Maybe. But even if that's true, he wasn't surprised by them coming because he went out to them. To me, I've always thought that this all just has the feel of a prior understanding to it. And again, only John tells us this. In the other Gospels, if you read them, of course, your mind will go to this part of the story. But look at the other Gospels closely. They don't tell us where this is all taking place. They take him to Pilate. Pilate could have been out in the middle of the field. Wherever Pilate was at, that's where they took him. But we know that they take him to the praetorium. They took him to Pilate. And the others don't tell us anything about Pilate having to come out of somewhere to them. Wherever Pilate is, there they take him. In the other Gospels, they just jump right into the interrogation. But like we've said before, it's important to John that we see not only what is happening, but where it's happening and why it's happening. So before we go on with the interrogation, what do you know about Pilate? Or what do you think about him from hearing this story or reading this scripture? What do you know about or what do you think about Pilate?
Well, he wasn't very popular with the Jewish people.
No.
He robbed their temple.
He pulled several stunts like that. No, he was not popular with the Jews at all. Anything else?
He thought Jesus was innocent.
Yeah, he did. What did he do about it, though?
He washed his hands.
Washed his hands up.
I've always struggled with Pilate. You know, on the one hand, it's kind of like the Jewish leaders, and they were the instigators. but he could have stopped it. And, I mean, but then he said, okay, who should I crucify?
Yeah.
Who should? So there's some hint that he knew he was innocent, but he didn't have the wherewithal, the guts, the fortitude, whatever you want to call it, to stand up and go against all that.
Go against the Jews, yeah.
He was afraid of an uprising.
He was. He was very much afraid of an uprising. But I mean, he's the Roman governor. Does he not have the power to quell an uprising?
He wanted to get back to Caesar.
Right, exactly. What you said, a lot of people have struggled with Pilate. And that's so many in your lesson next time, and I've done it in this lesson too, but a lot in the next lesson is ask you, what was his demeanor here? This is what he said, but how did he say it? You know, tone of voice is everything. I want you to think about exactly how he was saying it. What was he struggling with? There are those who basically say, oh, poor pitiful Pilate. He got caught in the middle, and and he was afraid to go against the Jews, and he just let them back him into a corner. And that's part of it, but he was the Roman governor. He was the one in charge. What really motivated him? And we'll cover that a lot more next time. Anything else that you know about him? I've got some bullet points here to share about him. Pilate was appointed to this position by Tiberius Caesar in 26 AD, and that would have been just a few years before Jesus began his ministry. As I've said before, there's a whole backstory to all of this of how when Herod the Great died and the land was divided up between 4 of his sons, 3 that we actually are concerned with Bible land, Israel area, but how one of them, being very young, was very I don't know exactly the word, overbearing, and he did a lot of things that he shouldn't, and they appealed to Caesar because of what he did, and he lost his position. Actually, I think it was Herod Antipas, that we'll talk about in a minute, that was there that day, was the one who appealed to Rome because of what his brother was doing, thinking that Rome, the Caesar, would actually allow him to rule over both of those sections, but they didn't. They said, we'll just send a Roman governor. We'll just do it ourselves. So he messed up there. But Pilate was appointed by Tiberius Caesar. As we've said before, the Roman governor was responsible for appointing the high priest. And ironically, during the whole tenure, I didn't write that down, I think he was governor for about 10 years, actually, total. During his whole tenure of governor, he only appointed Caiaphas. Caiaphas, we talked last time, remember about there was some connection there. We don't know what it was, but the fact that most of the previous governors had appointed new high priests nearly every year, and he left Caiaphas for 10 years, you get the feeling that there's something going on behind the scenes there. Josephus describes Pilate as tyrannical and cruel. He was extremely cruel. When we read this, it don't sound so cruel to me. He sounds like a wimp. They've got him under their thumb. But you got to know the whole backstory to know why and how they were able to do that. As you mentioned, in the years prior to this, he'd had several run-ins with the Jews. In his very first year as governor, somebody comes in and they're new in their position and they're going to run things. Well, his very first year, let me say this first. Israel was different. The whole Judean province was different than any other province that Rome ruled. Every other province that Rome ruled had multiple gods. the Greek gods, the Roman gods, they had multiple gods, and they had temples to all of them. We've seen that in Paul's journeys. But the Jews were different. They just had one God. And they were serious about this one God. I mean, you didn't mess with them about this one God. Well, Pilate comes in and he says, hey, I'm the governor. We're going to do it this way. And so he has the Roman soldiers come in, bringing their standards, their banners, which has the likeness of Caesar on it. He's going to bring that in to the temple complex. Well, that didn't go over very well. What law was he breaking there? Of the Ten Commandments, what was he breaking? No gods before me, no graven images. And the Jews, they hit the ceiling. They revolted. And so, I can't remember exactly what happened there. I think, as I remember, he left the Antonia fortress, went back. He left his soldiers there, left and went back to Caesarea. The Jews followed him down there, and they were protesting and revolting. And he said, if you don't cease and desist and go back, I'll have you all killed. And they said, have at it. They bared their necks to him. Somebody had to back down, and guess who it was? Pilate had to back down. Well, you back down one time, you've set a precedent. And there were 2 or 3 other incidences. What you said, robbing from the temple, what he was going to do is he was going to build an aqueduct. And because it was for their good, it actually was for their benefit. Because he was going to do that, he was going to take some of the temple tax to build it with. Oh, no, you don't touch the temple tax. And again, same scenario. They called his bluff. And he had to back down again. And like I said, there were 2 or 3 others of those things. And so Pilate had to actually give in to them on several occasions. And there had been another run-in between Pilate and Herod Antipas. Remember Jesus, and I don't remember the chapter and verse, Jesus saying something about Pilate mingling the blood of the Galileans' sacrifices with their blood. He actually killed Pilate actually had some Galileans killed. And, well, that's Herod's territory. Herod Antipas, he's over the Galilean area. So they had bad blood between them until this night. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But all of this had played together to put Pilate in a very tenuous position at best. He had to keep the peace. But you can imagine him saying, I may have to keep the peace, but doggone if I'm going to give in to those filthy Jews. I'll stick it to them as much as I can, as long as I can. Remember what we said about him probably sending the whole battalion of soldiers? You're afraid of this? Well, I'll just send you all the soldiers with it. He was mocking them by the number of soldiers that he sent. So, look at verse 29 again. Pilate therefore went out. He's not going to buck them over this. He's inside the praetorium. He went out to them and said to them, what accusation do you bring against this man? Well, Pilate had every right to say that. That's how every trial was to start. When you brought someone before the governor, you would have to state the charge first. That he had every right to say that in that way. But now here's the thing. Did the chief priests expect him to start that way? Or did they expect him to just rubber stamp this decision that they'd already made?
I think they expected the rubber stamp.
I think so. I think, and this is personal opinion, there are some commentaries that go this way and some that don't, but this is my opinion on that. When they went and got the soldiers the night before, there was an agreement. We're going to arrest him. and we may bring him to you, or we will, or I don't know exactly what would have been said, but I think Pilate knew they were coming. I think he was expecting them that morning, and that's why he was there waiting, and he went out to them. But when he said, "What accusation do you bring against him?" you can imagine them sort of, they're taken aback a little bit. And look at what they replied. Maybe kind of, can you imagine kind of sputtering a little bit? Verse 30, if this man was not evil, we would have not delivered him up to you. Did they state the charge? No. He's a bad man, and we brought him here. I mean, they don't know exactly what to say at that point. Whether they had presented, there was a charge eventually presented. Now, whether Luke 23 verse 2 tells us what the charge is. Now, whether they said the charge, whether he asked what the accusation is and they told him the charge, or whether they said this first and then said the charge, we don't really know. I think they said this first. He's bad. And then they say the charge. And that's found in, you don't have to look this up. I'll just read this. Luke 23 verse 2. They begin to accuse Jesus, saying, "We found this man," here's three things. "We found this man misleading our nation, forbidding them to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." That's the official charges. These three things. Now, what was the original charge back in the Jewish trials? Do you remember? Did they accuse him of any of this in the Jewish trials? Did the Jewish trials have anything to do with Caesar or Rome whatsoever? No. What was the charge back in the Jewish trials?
Claiming to be God's son.
Claiming to be God's son. Blasphemy, that's what that would be. There was a charge before that one. When they brought in the false witnesses, what did they charge him of saying he was going to do? Destroy the temple. That was an insurrection against the temple was a major charge to the Jews. Did Herod care? Pilate, did Pilate care? No, Pilate didn't care about that. And so they had to change the charge. It ended up being blasphemy. Like I said, first they tried to accuse him of wanting to destroy the temple. And we'll see why that was in a minute. But blasphemy. Why did they change the charge? Would Pilate care if he was charged with blasphemy? No. He claimed to be God. So, what's that to me? He didn't care. Pilate couldn't care less about blasphemy. So what did Pilate tell them to do? Verse 31. Look, got to get back to John. Verse 31. Pilate therefore said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." So what was the real reason, though, for bringing Jesus to Pilate? Look at what they said. The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." Now, isn't that interesting? The charge had to be changed in order for Jesus to be put to death by the Romans. Because the Romans are not going to put him to death for tearing down their temple. They're not going to put him to death for claiming to be God. They don't care. They had to change the charge. Well, that's another thing that makes this trial illegal. You can't change the charge. If somebody's accused of one thing, you can't change the charge. In Paul's first missionary journey, and again, this is how we've been going through Acts here at Huckleberry, and we just did this portion in Paul's first missionary journey. In his sermon in the synagogue at Pisidian Antioch, he would say to the Jews there that the Jews back in Jerusalem found no charge, no ground for putting Jesus to death, and they had to ask Pilate that he be executed. They didn't have a charge that would bring that kind of death, and so they had to go to Pilate. But now, I didn't realize this. This is interesting. It wasn't that the Jews didn't have any ability to sentence death. Now, many of the commentaries will say that the Rome had removed the ability or the to allow them. Rome had removed that from the Jews when they took over, when they conquered the Jews. But they still had one way that they could sentence death to someone. They actually had one, and that was if the charge of conspiracy to destroy the temple or to violate the sanctity of the temple had stood. When those false witnesses came in, if that charge had stood, he's going to tear down the temple, they could have stoned him. If you look at what Stephen was actually charged with, the sanctity of the temple was one of the charges. So they actually had that ability to stone someone, to put someone to death, but it had to be just for that one specific charge. And that charge didn't stand. They couldn't back it up. So he was convicted of blasphemy, but they couldn't stone him for that. So then they had to figure out a way. They wanted to kill him, but they had to figure out a way to get him to Caesar, to Rome, to do it. And I imagine, again, this is just my opinion, I imagine they could have said something to Pilate the night before, like, if we can't pull this off, you'll be seeing us in the morning. Maybe something to that effect. And so, how did Jesus have to die? Look at verse 32. John tells us, let me go back. The Jews said to him, we're not permitted to put anyone to death. And John tells us that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Did Jesus say he was going to be crucified? Yeah, he did. He actually said, not only did he say he was going to be crucified, he said he was going to be scourged. Nobody crucifies and nobody scourges but the Romans. Somehow or other, he had to be in front of the Romans. If he had not been crucified, then the Old Testament prophecies would have not been fulfilled. And Jesus would not have been the atonement for sin. If he just died any other way. Remember all the times the Jews picked up stones to throw at him and he just, or the time they wanted to push him off the cliff? If he died any other way, he wouldn't have been the atonement for our sin. He had to die on the cross to be the atonement. He had to become sin in order to be the atonement for sin. Jesus himself prophesied in Matthew 20, verse 19, and Luke 18, verses 18, verses 32 and 33, that he would be delivered to the Gentiles. So who's the only Gentiles around? The Romans. And that he would be mocked, and he would be scourged. And Matthew actually says that Jesus said he would be crucified. Luke says killed. But again, only the Romans scourged and crucified people. Jesus said this was going to happen this way.
So did Isaiah.
Oh yeah, so did Isaiah. But Jesus himself said that. Yeah, there are many Old Testament prophecies that said it was going to happen this way. The whole picture of the sacrificial system. When we did Matthew, some of you who were with us when we did Matthew, our whole Matthew study was connecting Jesus' crucifixion to the pictures of the temple sacrifices. Everything had to line up. He had to come before Pilate. So, the charge is changed. And Luke 23, verse 22 says, They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ the King." All three of these, any one of these would have brought him death. Misleading our nation, as far as Rome goes, that would have brought him death. Forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, oh, that would have really got him. And saying that he is the Messiah, a king, usurping Rome, all three of those, any one of those three would have brought him death. And then verse 33 of John 18 says, Pilate therefore entered again. I mean, you get this picture. He's in, he's out, he's in, he's out. He entered again into the praetorium, and he summons Jesus. John's the only one that tells us this. He summons Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, how do you think he asked this? Was he mocking? Was he suspicious? Was he fearful? How do you think he said it?
I think you just really wanted to know.
He needs to know because he's the governor. Are you the king of the Jews? So you're the king of the Jews, are you? Or are you the king of the... there's many ways that we can imagine that he may have said this. Notice Pilate did not say, did you say that? Did you do any one of these three charges? Did you say that you're the king? He doesn't ask him that. He didn't say, did you say it? He said, are you the king of the Jews? Maybe Pilate's getting a little frustrated now. In Matthew 27:13, we are told that Pilate said, "Do you not hear all the charges they're bringing against you? Do you not hear what they're saying? Are you guilty or not?" And did Jesus answer the question? Verse 34, did Jesus answer the question? No. How many times have we seen him do this? I mean, over and over and over again. Somebody will ask him a point-blank question and he never, well, I won't say never say never, but all the times I can think of, he does not answer it point-blank, especially the way they expect him to answer it. So Jesus said, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" In other words, is this your idea, or are you going on what they said? What do you think about it? So how did Pilate reply? Verse 35. Pilate says, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation, your own ethnos, your own people, and the chief priest delivered you up to me." So you got the priests and you got the temple guard. And so Pilate said, "Look, your own people brought you here. What have you done?" Essentially, Pilate's saying, I mean, you don't look much like a king. You're not acting much like a king. But yet, the chief priests have gone to all this trouble to get you here. What have you done? And again, think about Pilate's demeanor. How is he saying this? Is he afraid of maybe the Jews are setting a trap for him? Maybe they really don't want Jesus crucified, but they're out to get him this time. Whichever way you go, he's going to be wrong. He might be a little bit fearful. I don't think it's until later that his wife actually gets that message to him that we talked about before about that dream. But you got to put yourself in his shoes and think about how is he reacting to this. And again, Jesus doesn't specifically answer his question. Verse 36, 35, "What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, and that I might not be delivered up to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm, of this era, essentially. This is different than the other Gospels. When Pilate asks him, are you a king? Let's see. Verse 33. Are you the king of the Jews? In the other three Gospels, when Pilate asks him that point blank, Jesus replies, it is as you said. He doesn't go into this explanation as John would have us know. Actually, this is just an abbreviated version of what Jesus, it is as you say, it's just an abbreviated version of what Jesus would say next. But Jesus made it clear here in this verse that he is not here to be a physical king yet. I said in your lessons, Sandy, this is what we were talking about earlier. I said in your lessons that Jesus is known, we know Jesus to be prophet and priest and king. When will he fulfill his role as king? In the millennial reign, exactly. In his earthly ministry, before the crucifixion, before he becomes the sacrifice, in his earthly ministry, he is a prophet. He prophesied his own death. He prophesied what's going to happen during the tribulation. He prophesied many things in his earthly ministry. He was in his role as a prophet. Today, at this very moment, he sits at the right hand of God. He is in his role as the great high priest. Our study through Hebrews, I can't tell you how that changed my life. I had never understood Jesus' role as high priest. But that book just really opened that to me. He is in his role as the great high priest, forever interceding for us. What did the high priest do? He interceded for the people. And that's what Jesus is doing today. Hebrews 7:25 says that he ever lives to make intercession for mankind. But in the millennial reign, he will literally, physically sit on David's throne as king. There will be a real physical kingdom, and that's when he will be king. And so Pilate says in verse 37, so you are a king. And Jesus replies, you say correctly that I am a king. And that's where the other Gospels come in. The other Gospels say, you have said it. Not that I'm saying, yes, it is as you have said it. Here, John tells us that Jesus actually said the whole sentence says, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world. You can put a colon there. This is what it is. I have come to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of, or that little word thereof is ek, it means out of. Everyone who is out of or belongs to the truth hears my voice. When Pilate said at the beginning of verse 37, so you are a king, you can imagine him bristling a little bit. So you are a king. And then Jesus goes on, though. You said that correctly. This is why I was born, to bear witness to the truth. And then Pilate is like, oh, you're not a king now, but you'll someday be a king. Pilate sees that at that point. And as I said in your lesson, when has Jesus said that before? He adds, let me find my place here. He goes on, the last thing Jesus says here in verse 37, everyone who is of or belongs to the truth hears my voice. And we remember Jesus saying in John chapter 10, in verse 16 and again in verse 27, my sheep hear my voice. Those who are out of this, who are of the truth, who understand the truth, understand what I'm saying, understand my voice. So then what does Pilate finally say? That famous line.
What is true?
What is true? How did he say that?
I think that was a sincere question.
Could have been. Could very well have been a sincere question. Could have been resignation. What's true? And then goes out. Or could have been angry. Or what's it to me? What's true? You know, you'll hear people say, well, that's your truth. No, truth is truth, regardless. And so, that's the last thing that Pilate says, and he walks out. And he goes out to the Jews, and he says, John tells us, and when he had said this to Jesus, he went out again, outside from where they are, remember the in and out, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. And we can dovetail that back to John 23 again, verse 4. In John 23, verse 4, we read, after verse 2, they have laid out the charges. Verse 3, Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said, it is as you say. And Pilate goes out to the chief priests and the multitudes, just like John said that he is, and says to them, I find no guilt in this man. But what's interesting in that is verse 5. John doesn't tell us this, but Luke tells us that but these chief priests out there then say, but they kept on insisting, saying, he stirs up the people. He teaches all over Judea, starting with Galilee, and even as far as this place. It's like, not only does he do that thing, he's doing this too. I mean, they keep throwing out things that Jesus is doing, and the thought came to my mind, I think it's from some Shakespeare play that says, methinks thou dost protest too much. You know, they keep throwing out that, well, he does this, and he does this, and he's doing that. And Pilate's going, wait a minute. Did you say Galilee? He's been up in Galilee? Oh, well, let's send him to Herod. And that's how he goes toward Herod. And then they have the fifth trial that is in front of Herod Antipas, and only Luke covers that for us. So any comments or questions on this before we go into this last section? Okay, so put yourself in Pilate's place. Between, let me find where I've got it marked here. In verse 38, after Pilate says this to the Jews, you can draw a line in there. That's where he goes to Herod, in between that. And when he comes back from Herod, Herod says, I don't see anything that he's done wrong. And Luke actually tells us that Herod and Pilate were on better terms from that time forward. But when he comes back from Herod, he actually says this again. So the second part there of verse 38 actually is said twice in some regards. When he comes back again, Pilate goes out again and says, I still find no guilt in him. So put yourself in Pilate's place. Pilate thinks he's taking care of this mess. Essentially killing two birds with one stone. Getting rid of the Jewish leaders, because they went with him to Herod's, and getting himself back on good terms with Herod. So got all that taken care of. But the next thing he knows, here they come back again. And Luke 23, verses 13 and 14 says, and so Pilate's at it again. They came back, and Pilate summons the chief priests and the rulers of the people and said to them, You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion, and we've examined him. I've examined him. Herod's examined him. We can find no charge, no guilt in this man which you have made against him. I don't. Herod doesn't. He hasn't done anything deserving of death. So this is what I'll do for you. This is still from Luke. I will punish him. I will scourge him and release him. That wasn't going to happen. And by the way, I had one of your questions, one of those throw-out questions. How many times did Pilate say, I find no guilt in this man? Did anybody actually do that? Or did you just say it was a lot? That's what I did. Anyway, Elmer Towns, in his commentaries, tells us that Pilate tried to release Jesus 6 times. I didn't really count those and know that, but I take his word for it. Well, then picking up back up with verse 39 of John 18, Pilate said, but you have a custom that I should release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish that I release for you the king of the Jews? Well, let me back up. You have this custom. And here we have this curious custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover. And I say curious because it's found nowhere else outside of Scripture. Now, the historians talk about it. Josephus doesn't talk about it. Nobody talks about it. But it's in all 4 Gospels. So we know it happened. But we don't know anything else about it. And so he says to them, you have this custom that I should release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the king of the Jews? In all 4 Gospels, because it's in all 4 Gospels, it's familiar to us. Everybody knows that story, right? We're going to release Barabbas. You know that story. In Mark and in Matthew and John's Gospels, Pilate brings up the subject. You have this custom. Do you want me to do this? In Mark and Luke, we see that the multitude brings it up. But we also see that it is the priests who are stirring up the multitudes to do it. So the scenario could have gone like this. It could have been that all during these proceedings that the people were shouting, release Barabbas, release Barabbas. You know, if you've ever seen a crowd or something and the crowd is chanting something in the background and then the person down here is talking, you know, it could have been something like that. The crowd or the multitude in the back, release Barabbas, release Barabbas. And so Pilate says, look, you got this custom that you release someone. And he offers to release Barabbas. Now, again, we've got to remember this is a real event. There are a lot of other things taking place besides just this encounter between Jesus and the Jews. As we said earlier, whether Jesus had been arrested or not, this crowd would be there chanting for the release of Barabbas. Whether Jesus was arrested or not, 3 men were scheduled to be crucified that day. Whether Jesus was ever there or not. But we get this picture of all these things converging at once. Those 3 men getting up in their jail cells that morning thinking they're going to die that day. The crowd getting up early. People that knew Barabbas, that supported Barabbas, coming there early, wanting to be the very first ones there, shouting for the release of their leader, Barabbas. And then you've got the Jews coming in bringing Jesus. So you've got these 3 things converging that morning. When Pilate got up that morning, he knew he was going to release someone. He probably thought it was someone with a much lesser charge. Maybe jaywalking or something, you know. He never in his wildest dreams thought he would be confronted with releasing a murderer. But he knew he was going to be releasing someone. I don't think in a million years he ever expected it to be Barabbas. But as the morning broke, out in the courtyard of the praetorium, a crowd was gathering to petition for the release of Barabbas. At that same moment, the temple guard are dragging Jesus bound toward the praetorium. And Pilate is going to have to judge him. As I said, Mark and Luke tell us that the multitudes began crying for Barabbas, and I think they're doing this all along. Pilate then turns to the chief priests and he says, "But you got this custom. How about I release Barabbas? How about I give you Barabbas?" What do you think about that? Who would have ever thought that they would pick Barabbas? I mean, I was thinking, this is like saying to a kid, you can have all the ice cream you want, or you can have broccoli. What kid in their right mind is going to pick broccoli? Well, I've got one grandson that probably would, but besides Max, it's like a ridiculous choice. Who would ever think they would pick Barabbas? But here they are. What do? Verse 40. Therefore they cried out again, "Not this man, give us Barabbas." And you just got to imagine the blood draining from Pilate's face. And he's up against the wall again. They pushed him against the wall, and he's going to have to do it. Now, Barabbas, as you probably know, asking your question, what do you know about Barabbas? What do you know about Barabbas?
He was a scoundrel.
He was a scoundrel, but he wasn't just a scoundrel. What kind of a scoundrel was he? What did he do?
He murdered.
He was a murderer.
He was a leader of the rebellion.
He was absolutely.
I read somewhere that he was also part of the thugs, the zealots, that was the thug section of the zealots.
Yeah, they wanted to overthrow Rome.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's why Pilate is like, you mean I've got to do this now? Yeah, he would have never offered him if he thought there had been any chance that they would have picked him. Because the chief priests would have hated Barabbas just as much as Pilate did. Anything else you know about it? Well, I said in your lesson that he was, the name Barabbas means son of the father. Let me back up. He was more than, as we said, more than just a thief. He was an insurrectionist. He was who truly was guilty of leading a revolt against Rome. The thing that Jesus was accused of, Barabbas had actually done. Mark and Luke both tell us also that he was a murderer. He was the worst of the worst as far as criminals go. The name Barabbas, as I said, means son of the father. Bar meaning son of. We saw that in Jesus called Peter Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon son of John. We've also seen it in Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. What's the son of encouragement? From Acts. Who is it we've been talking about in Acts? Barnabas. Barnabas. Yeah, Barnabas. Son of encouragement. Yeah, Bar means son of. And Abbas means father. Son of the father. Well, every son is a son of his father. Yeah, but some of you may have kids that are more sons of their fathers than, or grandchildren that are sons of their grandfathers. But we say, well, that's always what it is. But it means more here. Son of the father. Many Jewish sources tell us his first name. Scripture doesn't tell us his first name. But many Jewish sources do tell us his first name. And his first name was Yeshua. His first name was literally Jesus. I mean, the name Jesus was a very common name. So Pilate is saying, which one of them do you want me to release? Jesus, the Son of the Father, or Jesus, the Son of God? That's essentially what Pilate is saying to them. But I found something else this week that was new to me. And that is, not only is it saying Barabbas, the son of the father, or the son of a father, it literally is saying, or instead of saying son of the father, which is what we've always said it said, it literally says son of a father, meaning a specific father, meaning they know who his daddy is, literally. Abbas, the fathers, it could have been referring to a well-known rabbi. Rabbis were known as the fathers. The rabbis who were the teachers were known as the fathers. We refer to the early church fathers as those great leaders who led as the church was getting established. When I read that for the first time, and I thought, they know who his father is. Who's the most famous Jewish rabbi that we know? No, the rabbi. Nicodemus. What if that's Nicodemus' son? I mean, that gives me chills to think about that. Today, there are many great ministries. One of the greatest teachers who's dead and gone now was Francis Schaeffer. Great teacher. But his son, Frankie, is an atheist. It just blew my mind to think that. Now, obviously, that's all conjecture. We don't really know. But what we do know is, and here on the one hand, you have Jesus, the Son of the Father. And you have on the other hand, Jesus, the Son of God. Which one do you pick? Can you see what's happening here? Whom will you choose to release?
He's given them one last shot.
Yeah, one last shot. Exactly. And I think he keeps reiterating that. This one or this one? Are you sure this is the one you want to pick? Whom will you choose? Jesus, the Son of the Father, who is actually guilty of what he was charged with? Or Jesus, the Son of God, who is innocent of his charges? There's one other thing that I want to leave with you before we close. We've shared this before. You may remember it, or as the old saying goes, you may have slept since then. There's something else that we need to know about releasing Barabbas that fulfills an Old Testament picture. In Leviticus chapter 16, we have the teaching about the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, you may remember what happens on the Day of Atonement. The high priest goes into the Holy of Holies for that one time a year that he can go. And he takes a sacrifice in. Do you remember hearing about the scapegoat? They bring these two goats in on the Day of Atonement. One of them they decree to be guilty, and they lay all of their sin on that goat. This one day a year, every sin they committed for that whole year is forgiven on this day because they laid it on that goat. And then there's the other goat that is innocent. Which one gets turned loose and which one gets killed?
Scapegoat gets turned loose.
The guilty one gets turned loose, and the innocent one is sacrificed. The high priest would draw lots with one goat, and one goat would be declared innocent, and one would be declared guilty. The guilty one would be released, and the innocent one would be sacrificed. Now, the scapegoat would eventually die, but it would die in its sins. It would die with the sin on it. In other words, it would die in its sin. Barabbas would be released that day, but he would die in his own sin at another time. And actually, there's one more attempt to free Jesus. Next time we'll look at Pilate's one last desperate attempt to release Jesus. And in so doing so, fulfilled prophecy and actually broke the law at the same time. So that'll be in the next lesson. Anything else? Any comments or questions? glazed eyes. It's a lot to take in. And I only covered 12 verses. I was working on this morning. I started in about 9:30. And at 1 o'clock, I had 2 verses done. And I thought, oh, I'm going to pick up the speed a little bit here. Oh. All right. Well, let's pray. Father, it is